All right, Exodus 12, let's call this one clear because it actually reminded me of a time working overseas with a young man who had functionally become my fixer. And if you're not familiar with the term fixer, it refers to somebody who more than simply translating language can help you translate culture and keep you out of situations where you could unnecessarily get yourself in trouble. And that is exactly what he had become really good at doing for me. But in this particular circumstance, we were trying to help another young man who had kind of become an outcast in his own city, living at a level of poverty that was uncommon even for a very impoverished country. And so the things that we were normally able to work out smoothly all of a sudden became way more confusing when our fixer did not want to work with this one young man. And I unfortunately had an idea of what would fix the communication gap as I pulled out an extra 20. All the things that had been so confusing that day all of a sudden became oh so clear. And it let me know I wasn't going to be able to work with that young man very much longer, because if I couldn't trust him to function simply on the integrity of a situation, then I wasn't sure I was going to be able to trust him in all the different situations we would need. And in many ways, that sets the stage for what we are seeing in Pharaoh's integrity in chapter 12 of Exodus, as we pick up in verse 29, where it reads, "At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians. And there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, Up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone." Understanding that the famous phrase, the carrot or the stick, is in a lot of ways what we're seeing play out here. I described for you a situation in which the young man got the carrot of the extra $20 to all of a sudden clarify his vision. Pharaoh's vision is being clarified here after he gets the stick in the form of the death of his firstborn. And so now he's finally responding to words he couldn't understand through 9 other plagues. It's now become oh so clear. But the most shocking part of the story may be in the part of the verse that I left off, because in some of his parting words to Moses, he's going to say, "And bless me also." In the midst of all this suffering he's caused in Egypt, all this death as a result of him not letting Israel go, he's still chasing a personal blessing, understanding the way in which he seems to have simply lost control, because that's really the way the story unfolds. Understanding that through at least the first 5 plagues or so, for the most part, he's hardening his own heart. After that, God's hardening his heart. He's lost control, and now in a lot of ways, he's functioning on instinct. In a lot of ways, that reminds me of Pavlov's dog. And if you haven't heard the story, it roughly goes that Pavlov used to feed his dog and ring a bell at each feeding. And over time, when he would ring the bell, the dog would think it was time to eat. And so just as Pavlov conditioned his dog, over time, it seems that Pharaoh simply became conditioned to seeking out his own self-interest. In much the same way, Paul is going to caution us in his letter to the Philippians that even in the church, we can become enslaved to our own appetites. Our appetites being a metaphor for exactly what we see out of Pharaoh, seeking our own self-interest. And anytime a biblical author is talking about another God, in a lot of ways, that's another way of talking about idolatry. And in Psalms, at least in 2 places, I think 115 and 135, it describes for us the practical outcome of idolatry, and that being us becoming like the thing we worship. Meaning if we bow down to a block of wood, over time, we're able to reason no higher than the level of a block of wood. And so likewise, if our self-interest becomes our God, we become able to reason no higher than the level of our self-interest. And so part of the tragedy for Pharaoh seems to be the way in which he was losing track of the way in which he was losing control. Since, as we've seen, over the first 5 plagues, for the most part, he was hardening his own heart. But after that, God stepped in and hardened his heart. And Pharaoh, even though he was functioning in a way that seemed like he was the one who was making decisions, he was basically functioning on instinct, as we said. Likewise, with idolatry, the psalmist helps us understand that even though we get to pick the idol, we don't get to control the idol, because over time we become like the thing that we worship. And so what Paul is doing in Philippians is trying to keep us off of a path in which we lose track of the way in which we're no longer driving the car, but we subtly descend into a place where we are simply enslaved to our own self-interest.